Welcome to our crop management outlook for 2020. I'm Nick Seiter, a field crop entomologist here at U of I. With me today are Dr. Nathan Kluchevsky, a plant pathologist, Dr. Aaron Hager, a weed scientist, and Dr. Gary Schnittke, our economist. And we wanted to put this together kind of at the beginning of the growing season to go over some of the issues that we might be facing in our respective areas to really try to get the growing season off to a good start from a management perspective. So I'll be talking about our insect management outlook for 2020, what we can maybe expect for insect management, particularly to begin the season. And we start with the corn rootworm, as we typically do in Illinois. This is going to be our most important pest of corn in Illinois year after year. One thing we've been noticing, and many of you have been noticing in recent years, is that we simply have lower populations of this insect maybe than we're used to seeing. Certainly lower populations over the last few years than we were used to seeing maybe 10, 20 years ago in particular. Several reasons for that. One of the big drivers, of course, is the widespread adoption of Bt traits, Bt technology for their control. We've also had some fairly unfavorable weather, at least unfavorable weather if you're a corn rootworm. So when we have late corn planting, big check mark for last year, unfortunately, those eggs will actually start to hatch before there's corn roots out in the field. And when those eggs hatch and there's no corn to feed on, the larvae starve to death, and that contributes to those low populations. In addition, when we have saturated soils as egg hatch is going on, again, big check mark for last year in that regard, those larvae will actually drown when the soil is saturated for long enough while they're hatching. Had both of those last year, and of course 2019 was a pretty low year, particularly low in terms of the adult rootworm population, both for western corn rootworm and for northern corn rootworm. And when we have that low adult population, that of course means that we would expect to have relatively low larval populations going into this next year. Now, keep in mind that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be uniformly low. What if we could go to the next slide? We do have an overall low risk of larval damage, but we did have some exceptions to that last year in terms of the adult population that we saw last year. If you could go to the next slide. We did see this situation pop up in several cases, which was an isolated field or plot of late planted corn. When you get that, and especially when one plot of corn is later than all the corn around it, that forms sort of a magnet for these adults later on in the season. And of course, as these adults are in there laying their eggs, that's the egg population and ultimately the larval population that we'll be dealing with this spring. And so we could expect to have a few of these hot spots out there that we need to watch out for. And that's really one of the reasons why it's so important to go out into your field during the summer, especially getting into late July, early August, and looking at the type of population that you have. And so while we expect our overall damage to be lower this year, that's not to say there aren't some spots out there that could experience some high population based on these isolated pockets of adult damage the previous year. If you could go ahead and advance to the next slide. So in terms of rootworm control, of course, resistance to those Bt traits is an ongoing concern. We do have resistance or reduced susceptibility to all of the below ground Bt proteins in Illinois. Now, note that I said to the proteins themselves. In general, our pyramided trait packages that express more than one of these proteins have remained fairly effective in Illinois in spite of the development of resistance that we've had. That's not to say we haven't had some instances of greater than expected damage, especially as you get into northern Illinois and in some of the areas that have a little more corn on corn. But that threat of resistance is out there, but so far we've performed very well, or fairly well for the most part, with these pyramided traits. One thing we do encourage you to do is to evaluate your trait performance and your insecticide performance if you're using a soil insecticide by examining roots for pruning in mid to late July after that damage has occurred, but maybe before the plant is starting to mature. We want to find out about this during the season. We don't necessarily want to wait until the end of the year from the combine when we see the corn lodged over. When you're evaluating this damage, what you're looking for are these pruned roots like we see in the picture here. Specifically, you're looking for roots that have been pruned to within 1.5 inches of the soil line. And when you see more than half of a node of roots that's pruned away like this, that's going to be unexpected damage if you have a pyramided trait package. And that's something that should concern you. That's something that you should notify your seed rep if you do see that. So we encourage you to go ahead and monitor this and just to watch, especially over time, how well these packages are performing for you. Now, in terms of soybeans, I wanted to highlight a different pest. If you could, yeah, there you go. And that's slugs. So slugs will feed on seedling corn and soybean, but we're particularly worried about them in soybean, where they damage those cotyledons and have more of a tendency to reduce stand. Now, I'll lose my entomologist card if I don't inform you that slugs are not an insect. And as a result of that, insecticides are not going to be effective for slug control. There are some bait products out there that'll do an okay job. Availability of those in Illinois isn't great, and in fact, we don't have many of them labeled in soybean where we could really use them. But what's really going to favor these slug populations is the weather conditions that we see. And it's all about moisture for these slugs. When we have wet conditions, that's when slugs do really well. In fact, the slugs do very well when it's wet and warm, but then the damage is going to be magnified when that crop is developing and it's cool, and it slows the crop down and limits its ability to outgrow that damage. So you could imagine the worst case scenario for slug damage is going to be when you have a warm, wet spring, dries out enough to plant, you get planted, and then it cools off in that field. And one thing we would encourage you to do if you get into a replant scenario for slugs, when you're in that replant scenario, you know that population is out there. So just try and wait until that field dries off, till it warms up a little bit. You know, the best thing to get rid of slugs is going to be warm, dry temperatures for several days in a row.